Well, I've spoken in the past about what was then a promised inquiry on how COVID was handled in the UK. I said a few things about how I feared it would go. Specifically, that it would mostly be about casting blame rather than openly learning lessons, that it would probably do so by asking the wrong questions based on highly challengeable assumptions. Now, I have no idea if at the end of the process that will be my takeaway. It promises to be a very long, drawn out and detailed process, so we should make no presumptions that it can't work its way to some genuinely important insights. But I have to say, at first glance of the first couple of weeks of public hearings, it's not looking tremendously encouraging. So yes, the first part of the inquiry, which is looking at whether the UK was as prepared as it should have been, has so far mostly been about blame. Specifically, we've seen interviews with former Prime Minister David Cameron, former Chancellor of the Exchequer George Osborne, to answer the question of whether perhaps they are to blame. In the wake of the financial crisis of 2010, their government followed a policy of austerity. Wasn't this, they were asked, what had been the problem? That the UK's National Health Service, jewel in the crown as it is, had been run down by austerity, left in an enfeebled state that made the country vulnerable to a pandemic. The chairman of the British Medical Association said as much. David Cameron's austerity policies had, he said, ground down and pulled apart public health systems, with cuts that meant the health service, quote, didn't stand a fighting chance. Now, that could be a reasonable course of discussion, but you'd first have to make some specific clarifications to take yourself out of the standard zero-sum game that we tend to play when it comes to the National Health Service. Namely, how much money would you be spending on the National Health Service if it was, quote, fully funded? What would it be able to do in that situation it can't do now? And what would it still not be able to do that you're prepared to defend as outside its remit? These are questions that can apparently never be answered. Instead, we get this stupid game. The Conservatives try to spend as much as they can on the NHS while keeping public spending down. Indeed, they went to some lengths to ring-fence it from the impact of austerity policies in David Cameron's day. The opposition say it's not enough. Well, fair enough. How much more would they spend on it? The answer, a bit more than the Conservatives. Whatever the spending today is, the answer is a bit more than that. And that's an answer that just never changes. However much the Conservatives do or don't spend, you can always promise that under your regime, it would be a bit more. Now, does a bit more get you to a fully funded service? Well, no, predominantly because such a service is pretty much impossible to envisage. I mean, we have made so much progress over the last 100 years, really. We now have so many drugs and treatments and operations that can save lives in so many different scenarios. Many of them, of course, are extremely expensive. And we discover novel treatments every year, some of those extremely expensive. And the truth is, given the size of a population, the variation in its various ailments and problems, however much money you spend on the NHS, there will be some highly expensive drugs and procedures that you just can't afford for the amount of benefit you get. The demand for health services, if not quite infinite, certainly highly elastic. And wherever you draw the line, whatever is included in the shortfall area, somebody can point at that and say, because you're not spending that extra bit of money to afford that, people will die. Which is exactly the sort of language the issue is routinely discussed with. It's worth noting that the BMA praised Wales, run by Labour, for having increased in real terms its public health spending before the pandemic. So, did that sound investment make itself felt in terms of better health outcomes during the pandemic? Kind of the point of the inquiry. Not exactly. In age standardised mortality rate for deaths involving COVID, it was actually higher in Wales than it was in England. A cynic might suggest that politics rather than performance would be getting in the way of the analysis here. Far be it from me to comment. How does the UK compare across the world on resource questions? According to the World Bank, the UK spends nearly 12% of its GDP on healthcare. Sweden, with its uber high tax rates, comes in lower than that at 11.28%. Now, Germany and France are a little higher at 12.81, 12.21 respectively. But then Denmark, Ireland, Italy, Japan, Spain, China, all lower, some of them much lower. The point is that if you review what happened across the world with COVID, by and large, it just doesn't make a huge amount of sense to start with a presumption that we should have been well prepared. And if we weren't, well, someone should be hung out to dry. Because almost no countries were well prepared. Almost every country made arguably suboptimal choices, particularly in the early stages. If that hadn't been the case, then sure. If Britain was only one of a small handful of countries that did especially badly, you would want to know what it was that all these other reasonable countries led by reasonable governments had done that we had so woefully missed doing. That is not the situation. Now, you can, of course, observe that certain countries were better prepared. Certain others responded more optimally. And that's great. We can learn the lessons from what they did. We want to do better. Complacency is no virtue. There's no argument for that here. Now, in that context, South Korea is mentioned favourably. Whereas most Western countries based their preparation on the possibility of a flu pandemic, Korea's experience with MERS had given them recent experience with a respiratory virus. Specifically, by the way, recent experience where they were held to have had a flawed response. Yes, we still mostly learn from mistakes. It's just that for governments, as for individuals, we mostly only learn the lessons from our own mistakes, not from those of other people. But having learned from its past errors, South Korea implemented early capacity to test and quarantine cases and was able to avert lockdowns and significant impact in the first year before vaccines became available. Oh, and by the way, they spend significantly less on healthcare as a percentage of GDP than we do, at just 8.36%. So just maybe, it's not about how much money you spend, but maybe what you do with it. In any case, very surely plenty to learn from South Korea, but hammering people for not having learned it before COVID struck, well, fine, you can do that if you want a topic for demonising people because of your political bent. It makes for good clickbait, and that seems to be what drives our political discourse these days. So yes, it's inevitable. But like I said, since almost no countries did otherwise, it's really just a game of bemoaning human nature. We human beings, we don't learn from history. We may conduct exercises with hypotheticals, but we don't treat the outcomes of those with seriousness so long as they remain hypothetical, not the sort of seriousness that spends lots of money. In my experience, this is the case whether you're talking about governments or private companies or other institutions. I suppose the military might be better, since the stakes are higher if they fail to grasp some likely scenarios tend to involve life and death, although I'm betting the performance there is only better to a matter of degrees because we're still talking about human beings. And look, this is a good focus for the learning, the fact that we fail to learn from others' mistakes and we fail to implement changes based on our modelling exercises of various scenarios. Yes, we should be learning from that. We could do better. David Cameron and others certainly agreed that this had been a genuine failure. that the government had put all of its focus into dealing with a flu pandemic and not a different type. Mea culpa. There needs to be a more rounded resiliency programme, well funded, that looks at a wider range of potential threats to our society. Would it make a difference? Well, it might do. I mean, ultimately, when a big crisis breaks and all the politicians in charge have got the wind up them, don't imagine that much of that preparation makes it into the day-to-day decision making when people are rather panicky and the headlines are driving responses. But some of it might, and it's certainly worth doing. There's a rule in the military, and also in elite sports come to that when you're in the heat of battle, you degrade to the level of your training. Now, dusty documents stored in the bottom shelf of a locked filing cabinet, which I imagine they still have in the British Civil Service, or at least the digital equivalent anyway, that doesn't count. That doesn't play a part in that. As Oliver Letwin noted in his contribution to the hearings, ministers change jobs just as they're getting to grips with their brief, civil servants likewise. So if you want to know why you end up with a panel of scientists and other assorted experts apparently having more influence than might be considered to be wise, well, that would be why. Will we learn that lesson? Maybe. But not if the inquiry becomes a vehicle for political point scoring, and not if the question is how much money should have been spent on the health service in order to be better prepared. It's a question that bewilderingly never seems to start with the other question of how much money did you have to spend at the time. George Osborne made the case that without austerity policies, the country's finances would have been in much worse shape, and so the government wouldn't have been able to spend the many billions that it did directly supporting people through a lockdown. And the principle of that has to be right. I mean, that doesn't mean I necessarily think the exact policies that he followed under the name of austerity were right. The devil for all of that is in the detail. I have no doubt you could mount some robust challenges to specific decisions they took. But those challenges have to be based on something more specific than the contention that if you'd been there, you could have spent a bit more on public services, and we don't need to worry about where that money would have come from. Sure, it would have been fine. It's just not honest. We can all promise to spend money that we didn't have. Now, we can't run a split A/B testing on reality to see what the opposition would really have spent if they had been in government at that time. It's easy always to claim it would have been a bit more and that there would have been no unintended consequences to spending it. Now, I know that all of us would like to see the inquiry particularly get on to the next stage, the subsequent question of how the government actually did in its response once COVID had hit. That phase is still to come, probably sometime in the future. And that's where we'll see the true battle of the perspectives. Some will want to ask, why didn't the government lock down earlier and harder? Others will want to ask, why did it lock down at all? And it will be very predictable. The opportunity, if we had a political environment that was capable of nurturing it, would be if people could set aside their settled perspectives on all of that and were able to ask the questions afresh, looking for evidence. Given what we've seen since, what do we think were the actual benefits and the actual costs of lockdown policies? Did the benefits outweigh the costs? Which bits would you keep? Which bits would you avoid in the future? Not to cast blame. Again, most countries pursued lockdowns, and even if we all decided that had been a colossal mistake fed by panic and groupthink, again, it can't have been an unreasonable mistake if so many countries made it. And if a case is there that it wasn't a mistake at all, but the benefits actually did outweigh the costs, then it would be the time to have that case made, as rigorously and expertly as it can be. None of that's going to happen, of course. People have pinned their identities on whether they were for or against lockdowns, enthusiastic about or hostile to various medical procedures that they decided for some reason to have an opinion about. Generally, both sides will argue as though their basic premises that they held then are self-evident and morally absolute, by the way, just as they have been for the last 2 years. So the best we can hope for is that the inquiry will ask the right questions, suffer patiently enough sessions of people shouting into the void that those people may feel that they've actually been heard, and then come to a conclusion based on actual evidence. Maybe that's what will happen, and it will be a real contribution. But as I say, the first couple of weeks have not been encouraging. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.